Hello, and welcome to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen Haupt, and I'm joined today by Father Boquet, our president. Hello, Father.
Good to see you again, Colleen.
It's good to see you, too. And today we're going to be talking about voting from a Catholic perspective. So considering the questions whether or not Catholics have a moral obligation to vote, what principles should decide who they vote for, and then we're going to end the podcast by talking about a couple key states that have very pro-life or very anti-life things coming up on the ballot. So we'll talk about that at the end of this podcast. So
very good, Colleen. It's a very important subject because, especially as we approach now midterm elections but really whether it be the local or regional or state or federal level, as Catholics, we approach these very important issues from our Catholic principles. And so it's a great conversation to have.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to have one on voting so that we could have a resource for key principles that we need to consider. So let's just start with the obvious question then. Do Catholics have a moral obligation to vote?
So I came prepared today, and I know that it's good that our listeners can't see my table, or our table, I should say, and that is because it's covered with paper right now. Because the Catechism teaches, our bishops teach on this issue, all based in Catholic moral principles. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to read from the Catholic bishops here in the United States. Now, this is a document in my article of a few weeks ago when I start talking about the subject of how to approach the initiatives on current ballots. So that's why we're doing this today, help guide people. It's called Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship. So there's a link in the article that people can go to read the document much more fully. But here, what I'm making direct reference to is the bishop's kind of answer to the question. It says, as Catholics, including those seeking public office, our participation in political parties or other groups in which we may belong should be influenced by our Catholic principles. So before I answer, should we be participating, there the bishops make it clear that, our approach is always from our Catholic perspective, our Catholic view, our Catholic moral tradition. And so with that, Catechism of the Catholic Church, 2239 and 2240, Colleen, is what I would really direct our listeners toward. I'm not going to read them in full because they're long, but it says, 2239, it is the duty of citizens to contribute along with the civil authorities to the good of society in the spirit of truth, justice, solidarity, and freedom. The love and service of one's country follows from the duty of gratitude and belongs to the order of charity. So the Church very clearly, universally, not just about the United States. So the first one was a quote from the Catholic Conference of Bishops in the United States, but drawing from the universal teaching of the Church that as citizens of the United States, particularly our country, that we approach this conversation with a moral duty, because we want to promote the common good. And in promoting the common good, then I have a way of exercising that through the power of voting as a U.S. citizen. So yes, we have a moral duty to contribute to the common good, to help bring to that common good the reality of what is just, what is true, and what is beautiful, and obviously in solidarity, with our brothers and sisters as an act of charity. So it's very important that we see our role in this. And I know that many people maybe don't want to approach, voting because they're for whatever issues. But I would challenge us, especially as Catholics, that that we reevaluate, this decision and really approach this from a way of promoting the good and being able to advance the good and also to prevent harm to the common good. So we can see ourselves contributing here to civil society in a good way.
Yeah. And then going into the specifics of what ideas principles should be guiding our voting, what are the non-negotiables? I know that's a phrase that gets thrown around when Catholics are talking about voting. Can you just clarify what those are for our audience and how they apply to voting?
And I think the best way to do that, I'm going to rely upon a couple of sources. And I just want to, as I share these, there are a number of places where, as Catholics, we can find information. I know we're going to end the podcast with that, but I'll make reference to them now just to kind of put them in people's eyes and minds, and so that we hear them. So when I was in parish ministry, all right, so a lot of times as pastors, you're looking for information that is easy, accessible, and very clear, and for people to use, and that they can understand. There were always two sources I went to. So I would rely upon EWTN's teaching on these issues regarding Catholic voting and how does a Catholic approach. And the one on EWTN is going to be a little more extensive by getting into the principles in a little more detail, giving a little history of our participation in the common good. And the other source really comes from Priests for Life. And it's one that I used very, very strongly in the parish because it was concise and it was basically almost like bullet points. And so I make reference to them so that our listeners can go back to those. And I know that we're going to make reference to them again, and they'll be there for people to have access to. But so I'm going to rely right now on the one from Priests for Life to help answer that question. So when you look at the non-negotiables, and now there are 5 in particular that we're speaking of here, but to understand those principles, Colleen, there's a fundamental principle, and that fundamental principle is the dignity of the human person, the dignity of human life. Now, for that, I'm going to go back just for a second and pick up from the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops. So, Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship says, the bishops reaffirm their opposition to the violence and crime of abortion, stating the threat of abortion remains our preeminent priority because it directly attacks life itself, because it takes place within the sanctuary of the family. And it continues. So right immediately, we hear the bishops not address a very fundamental issue, an assault on innocent human life, on the dignity of the human person. So with that, the non-negotiables build. So the first one that we're dealing with is abortion, the direct and intentional assault on innocent human life. Never permissible, never can be chosen. So that's what I mean by non-negotiables, that these are things that cannot be compromised. These are very, very fundamental for us as Catholics to understand and to also, as we approach the common good, as we approach making these decisions, there's never a justification. And so, which means we don't negotiate here. The second one is on the issue of euthanasia. So this, again, deals with whether an act or an omission that causes or leads to the death of another human being. So as we've talked about many times in our podcast, Colleen, I can never hasten or cause the death of another person, nor can I do that to myself. So it's very important. So abortion, euthanasia, which goes with this now, we're talking about embryonic stem cell, research. And that would be the third. Now, again, because we're dealing with a human being. So with life, and because every life has value, even in its most youngest developmental stage, must be protected and can never be used or utilized. John Paul, talked about this in Evangelium Vitae many times, and I think it's important that we realize that human embryos are human beings, human persons, and we need to defend them. Non-negotiable. And I think many people don't realize that, when you look at some of the candidates on the state level and on the federal level are advocating for embryonic stem cell research. This is immoral. It cannot be chosen as a good, no matter what the ends are that one wants to do. The ends never justify the means. So go back to that teaching. And also now, which is not one that most people are familiar with, the issue of human cloning. So that's the fourth one, and then finally anything or the fact of upholding the dignity and the sacredness of marriage between one man and one woman. And so here again, anything that contradicts that good cannot be supported. So we're looking at those 5, and why? Because we're dealing with human persons who are of incomparable value and never can be compromised. And because we're dealing with the good of the human person, we must also not only defend that good, we have to advance and promote that good. And so in each of these, the good is not being upheld, so it's not being defended, and it's also not being advanced if there's legislation or if there is a person advocating for laws, to promote an assault on these goods. So these are where we as Catholics approach, as I quoted from the very beginning, from our Catholic view, from our Catholic understanding of these moral principles about the dignity of the person and the dignity of human life. So that's important, Colleen, as we approach these kinds of conversations. And if you give me a little leeway, I'll kind of lead into some of the things you mentioned earlier that we're going to talk more in detail. So if we look at some of the ballot issues in some of the states, so we see, because of the overturning of Roe by the U.S. Supreme Court on June 24th, that we know that this issue alone, the abortion issue, has now returned to the states for debate. Many of the states, because of their trigger laws, already are advocating for life, and abortion is no longer permissible in those states. But it doesn't mean that there are not those trying to change that. So let's not talk about them. Let's only look at the ones right now, like in California or in Vermont, that are advocating for basically just opening the door for abortion rights and claiming it to be a right and making it part of their constitution and so forth. So as Catholics in the state, there are over 12 million Catholics in the state of California. So as I mentioned in a recent column, the bishops of California are calling upon all of the Catholics of the state to vote no to Proposition 1. And why? Because it is an assault on human life and human dignity. And it cannot be in any way supported by Catholics, really by anyone, but the bishops are speaking specifically, to the Catholic population. Why? Because we're dealing with the first non-negotiable. We cannot advocate, support a law, or support an attempt to create a law that would advocate for the taking of an innocent human life. You can't do that. So to all the Catholics in the state of California, who are approaching the ballot box, in good conscience, you cannot vote for this. And if you do, you're voting for that which is intrinsically evil. So this is what we're talking about. These are intrinsic evils. In and of themselves, they can never be advocated, and afar. And so I think it's important for us to look at that. And so those are the main things. So I hope that kind of on the non-negotiables. Now, there is a little confusion because when you get to the ballot box, it may not be as clear. So when you come to these websites and that we're going to give to you today, is you may go, okay, it's not as clear that in the language. So which means you have to read. You have to read what the initiative is, Colleen. You have to look at what is it saying, what is it advocating for, or what is it against, what is it for, and then come back and and look at these principles and say, okay, no, this is advocating for abortion to be like in Michigan, or in many other states that are advocating, for literally, these things. So I think it's important just to be aware of what they are and how to approach them.
Definitely. And then if you have a candidate who has like the Catholic approach to like immigration or economic principles or things like that, but they support a non-negotiable, do those lesser goods ever outweigh his support of a non-negotiable?
Right. So again, because we're dealing with something that's intrinsically evil, so issues of abortion, euthanasia, embryonic stem cell research, cloning, and the assault on the dignity of marriage between one man and one woman, that, they're non-negotiables. So, and even though there may be other things that are of importance, and there are, let's go back to the bishop's statement with regard to abortion. But again, because they're speaking about an intrinsic evil, it's a preeminent issue. It's an issue that trumps the rest. It overrides. And so they have to be first looked at. And so even when we talk about the compendium on social doctrine, and we look at the wheel of justice, for example, in looking at social principles and the teachings of the church, when you look at the wheel of justice, the first fundamental principle is human person. All right? And then the second one is human dignity. Why? Because that's the starting point. And also it's a wheel. Because it starts at one, it comes all the way around. So all the other principles that make up the wheel of justice, in the sense of, whether we're talking about immigration, healthcare, or whether we're talking about, the issue of dealing with the workers' rights and so forth, the option for the poor, whatever those solidarity, subsidiarity, all these principles, they come back to the human person, because that's the starting point, is the inalienable dignity. All right. So this immutable dignity, unchangeable dignity, all right, this inherent dignity. So I'm using these words that I'm hoping all of our listeners are keenly aware of, and that's the starting point. So Yes. So let's say, I'm going to use an example. Let's say that I approach, a situation in my state where there are various ballot initiatives. So let's just say that I look at this candidate. All right. So let's start with a candidate. Let's not, because right now Proposition 1 is not a candidate.
Yeah.
Proposition 1 is a ballot initiative in the state to change its constitution. So, but I'm approaching, say, a candidate. And I'm looking at our candidates and I'm evaluating. So as I'm weighing out, let's say, two candidates, the first thing that has to be asked is where are their positions on these non-negotiables? What are their beliefs? What have they done? If they've already been in government, what have they voted for? What have they advocated for? What have they written on? What have they spoken publicly? So as you can tell, immediate Colleen means, wait a minute, I got to do my homework. Yes. I have a moral duty because I'm wanting to advance the common good, what is good for society, which means I have to approach this with that mindset. And so the first is those non-negotiables, those very clear guiding guideposts. All right. So let's just say that both of them are equal here. All right. Let's just say that both, sadly, are not very good on these issues. All right. And let's say that, 2 out of the 5. So 2 out of the 5, already wrong. But these are the only 2 candidates I have. So how do I approach them? What is my response? So now I need to keep looking down.
Oh, you mean 2 out of the 5 non-negotiables?
Right.
I thought you meant 2 out of the 5 candidates.
Sorry,
okay.
no. Sorry.
So you have 2 candidates.
Right. 2 candidates out of the 5. And
okay.
let's just say that they both approach all 5 of them the same.
Okay.
So now what do I do here? Because the issue here is to exercise, my moral obligation and to advance the common good and to protect the common good, I need to look at this, which one of these candidates will cause lesser harm. So it's a question here, I have to really look at this, and now maybe I will come down, and start looking at those other issues that affect our culture and affect our society, and it may involve healthcare issues. It may involve the issues on immigration. It may involve issues of healthcare. Of worker rights and, and all these other various complexities of the human society. But again, I have to start with those non-negotiables. Mm-hmm. And so that's the starting point. So obviously, let's say I'm back to my 2 candidates, mm-hmm. and one upholds those non-negotiables, and the other does not. Very simple there. I have one candidate that now is I can offer my support to. And the real problem is today, the confusion is people start weighing out those things that are below those negotiables. The
lesser goods.
Right.
Yeah.
As equal. They're not. They're not on the equal par. And so it's important that's why the church's teaching on this is very important for us, all of us, mm-hmm. to understand, to learn, and to be able to apply.
So basically you start by looking at the non-negotiables, and it's like, if one is clearly superior to the other, they don't support any and the other person supports all 5, right. You don't consider those other lesser goods if those are your only 2 options. You have to go with the one who doesn't support any non-negotiables. And then if they both support the same 2, they're equally the same on their support of the non-negotiables, then you can look at those lesser ones. Or if neither supports the non-negotiables, then you look at those lesser goods. Okay.
Yeah, it's important, as you explained very beautifully, is that, as you can see, it puts the onus on myself to know what these people are uphold, or what they're advocating or not advocating for.
What if you have one candidate who supports all 5 and one that supports only 1? In that case, would you pick the one that only supports 1 because he's going to do less harm than the one who supports all 5?
Well, that's a very important phrase. So obviously, both are wrong in the sense of whether it be the one advocating for all 5, mm-hmm. In the sense of, for abortion, for euthanasia, for embryonic stem cell research, for human cloning, and for same-sex unions. And another candidate, advocating for 1 out of the 4, believing that euthanasia, it should be something allowed. The person should be able to allow them to make their decision. So how would I approach? How would the church guide me in approach? So obviously, we're not pleased with either candidate at all. And so then I have to look at, okay, which one, just based on those 5, would cause lesser harm, okay? And it's pretty clear that, I'm not supporting this person because of their positions on euthanasia. I'm completely opposed to that, and the church would be opposed to it, and I would not be supporting this candidate in this cause whatsoever.
And that has to be your intention behind it, too.
That's correct. And so here, what I'm recognizing that one of these two candidates is going to be elected. So which one will cause the lesser harm? And so if I had an ideal situation, neither one, but one of these two people is going to hold this office. So which one will cause lesser harm, and then we can begin to work with and maybe gradually guide them, help them transform their mindset. So but the idea is that recognizing that by exercising my duty, recognizing my responsibility to the common good, wanting to advocate for the good of the common good, the good of society, and what promotes human flourishing, and that this is where my intention is, this is what the church is calling me to be active in, and because of my position in the United States, I can exercise that ability through voting, at various levels within government, and to choose candidates that will advance that good. And so it's important to approach that. And, ideally, we would want candidates completely supporting life, supporting family, supporting the dignity of every human life. That's what we want to get. And that's the kind of candidates we want and we should be advocating for. So, and we're not there yet, sadly. And so we need to keep working at that. And we need to keep encouraging people, who value these values, to place themselves up for consideration for leadership roles, and we need them so desperately. Just as a side note, Pope Benedict would even say that, we need to not run away from the political conversation, but we need to run toward it. So I would say here, just in my little kind of soapbox, we need good candidates. We need men and women who advocate for these intrinsic values, and to be able to advocate for them, to defend them, to fight for them, and to see that it's good for all of society to promote the dignity of marriage, to support, human dignity and the sacredness of human life, and to settle for nothing less. We want that.
How would the non-negotiables play into local politics? Where obviously we're used to it being happening on like a national level or a state level, where you're trying to have state elections or state laws that are being passed. But how would it affect more on a local level? Is it still important to consider?
Sure. Well, let's look at school boards. I think that's a good example. So that's on a local level. It's also on a state level. You have Bessie boards and so many things. But just on the local level, what does this candidate believe? Right now we're dealing with this, here in the state of Virginia. We've had problems, and people have been aware it's been up in the headlines. And so local school boards make a huge impact and are advocating for policies and procedures on the local school level. And, so that is very, very important, because we may not be dealing with, obviously it's not an issue that they're not legislators, so they're not going to be voting on laws that advocate for abortion, but they may be promoting policies that, advocate for it on the local school level, changing ordinances and rights of parents begin compromised. And we've seen that. We know that's happening. So on the local level, it's important to know what these individuals are advocating for and what do they believe? And so in some cases we don't know, because they've never served in public office before. They've never, they don't have a voting record. They don't have a public forum that we've seen thus far. But, all of us live in society. People know people. So it's important to ask the right questions, to go to meetings, go to where they have a rally, listen to what they're saying. What's their platform? What are they advocating for? Or maybe, and also not just advocating for, but what are they not saying? That's also very important, which kind of goes back to what I said earlier about euthanasia. It's not just acting to cause the death of another human being, but it's also the sin of omission. What am I omitting? So in here, what is someone not saying that maybe should raise the hair on my head and say, wait a minute, and pose a question, ask a person very respectfully, what are your positions on this? Can you explain more about that? So it's very important, even on the local level, Colleen, for people to be engaged. And I know for myself, I still vote because I'm still a resident of the state of Louisiana, and I still have a residence in my home diocese, and so it is home. And so I usually, not usually, I participate in when voting things come up, and I have either I go home for it, especially when it's a state level. In a federal election, I make an effort to get home. If I can't, then I get an absentee ballot, or I do everything I can to be part of the conversation because I'm concerned about the common good in my own state and on the federal level. And at the same time, I'm also looking at local things. And so it's important for all of us to see that and make sure that we understand. So when we walk in that booth, it's not a matter of me just pushing a button or clicking a lever or whatever dynamic is happening within the voting booth. But how many people don't do that, and they inadvertently vote for something? And I think again, it's important to realize that if we have a candidate, or a ballot initiative, and we need to be aware that we also become complicit, in this. I might not I'm not the legislator that's been elected that's voting, but by me voting for the legislator that does vote, I'm indirectly participating here. So I think it's important to see that I have a role in this, and it's not far removed. And I think a lot of times we want to excuse ourselves that I'm far removed from that conversation. No, I'm not, because I'm part of the human family, and I have an ability to exercise a protection to the common good and to flourish something for the flourishing of the common good. So, pardon me. So I think it's good for people, especially for Catholics, not to be afraid of this. And I think a lot of times they're uncertain of how to approach. They're uncertain of the candidate or the initiative, and maybe the lack of resources to get the information they need. And it's intimidating. And so some people just say, okay, I'm just not participating. Or, as you brought up earlier, Colleen, look, got two very nasty people here. I don't want anything to do with that. Okay. You can approach it that way. I mean, you have to, in conscience, decide, but guided by the church's teaching, the church would not say not to be engaged. The church would not say to me, don't do anything. No, as I've been reading and again, guiding people, Catechism of the Catholic Church, 2239, 2240. We can go to Evangelium Vitae. There's many, many places in the church's teaching, and going back to the Bishops' Conference on faithful citizenship, obviously the church is saying, no, you be engaged. Be active in this conversation. We're part of the human family. We're part of society. We are faithful citizens of our country here in the United States, and that we should be engaged in this conversation and do everything we can. And we can do this by our exercise of voting to promote the common good. And so it's important to see that as a moral duty, to see it as a contribution that each of us is making to this conversation. So I think it's very, very important. And so does the church.
Yeah. And then going back to specifics of this coming election, which states have pro-life issues on the ballot that people should be aware of?
So one would be, for example, like in Kentucky. We talked a little bit about this, and that's one example. And there's a great link. And I'm going to pull my column out so that I can make direct reference to them and help. So I make sure I'm giving the right information as we're talking about so many issues here. So in Kentucky, we have voters will be asked to vote what's called Amendment 2. Okay. So I'm gonna take it slow so that I can make sure I get the right, propositions or amendments. This is Amendment 2 in Kentucky, which would make it clear that there is nothing in the state constitution that creates a right to abortion. So here's an opportunity in the state of Kentucky, not just for Catholics, but for all people who are advocating for life, to recognize there is no language in the Constitution that gives a right to abortion. Amendment 2 is something we want to support. So it's interesting, here in Montana, we have a very interesting one as well, and it's called Montana LR 131. Okay, so all these links are in the column, for all of our listeners, so they can go back and look at them. Here, it's called. This deals with children that are born alive. So what it's dealing with here is a child that is born alive is to be treated, cared for, loved, and protected. So this is what this is advocating for. Because as we know, the horror stories, and we hear it from nurses, we hear it from family members, we hear it from so many people that sadly children who are born alive, who have survived, the issue, the attempt of an abortion, and are left to die in a corner of a room. So Montana is saying no to this. At least that's what's on the ballot. And I'm hoping the people of Montana of good conscience and goodwill will recognize that there's never a legitimacy for abortion. This is not what one is advocating for. But what it's advocating is that if a child survives this horror, this attempt on its life, that the child should be protected. And that's what's going on in Montana. So those are two right off that I would acknowledge. And so there are a few others that I would encourage by them going. What I would say, Colleen, is to find out more information what may be happening in your own state. Is there are two places to go. One would be the local, the state Right to Life office or website, and the other one would be by going to the Catholic Conference of Bishops in your state. Each state has its own kind of regional or state conference of bishops. And the bishops themselves have people who are lobbying for Catholic teaching in regard to legislation and ballots and initiatives. So it'd be good to go to their website. I know in Louisiana I can direct people directly to that. And the same thing in California, where I've been helping with Proposition 1 and talking about it, as we've done many times here before. And so that's a resource. And that would be good because there could be other things that are happening that I'm not aware of and which I know are happening. So it's important for people to become aware of it. So they enter the voting booth aware of what's out there. So those are just two examples.
Okay. And then which states have pro-abortion issues on? I know you've mentioned Proposition 1. I know we've talked about Vermont before and Michigan. So let's just cover those so people in those states are aware.
So in Proposition 1, just kind of backing up to that. So it's here, we already have a very bad law in California. All right. What this is going to do now is, literally place into the Constitution a right to abortion. And so that, and also with that right would come the state's responsibility to protect it. It would be very difficult for any pro-life legislation to be advanced because of that, the change in the Constitution. And it also would make taxpayers in the state of California obligated to pay for those who seek an abortion. Not only people in California, but as Governor Newsom has said, well, let's bring people from other states. Let's become, an abortion, that sanctuary and whatever the language he's using. So this Proposition 1 has to be rejected. And so that's what I would, again, just remind people of. In the state of Michigan, we have Proposition 3. Now, this is a little one that's filled with a lot of language. And so I'm going to read it so that we hear it. But it's detailed. But this is what's happening there. This would affirm a constitutional right, quote, to reproductive freedom. Now, any of us engaged in the pro-life movement, any of us engaged in this conversation for any length of time will know that this means, the right to abortion, the issue of contraception, the issues of sterilization, and so forth and so on. This defines, again, quote, the right to make a decision about all matters relating to pregnancy, including but not limited to prenatal care, childbirth, postpartum care, contraception, sterilization, abortion care, miscarriage management, and infertility care, end quote. There's a lot in there, Colleen. And so there are a lot of things, and what I often see in many initiatives is the kind of lumping a lot of things together. And some people might say, well, we would want to see, postpartum care. Okay, good. We want to see childbirth, care. So, but then at the same time, you're seeing other things that are not, moral and that are intrinsically evil acts that can never be supported or encouraged. So this is important for people to read and for people to know this is not something that's good at all. So, and it's important to say no. So
it sounds like they're just trying to disguise what it is. They're like, here's these list of things that are good. Oh, and we're also going to throw in abortion and sterilization and all of these other really terrible things. And we're masking it by making it sound good.
And then I think it's also important, as I go into a little bit here. So in North Carolina, So now we're dealing, not necessarily with a ballot initiative, but what do we have? So here, Governor Cooper, has vetoed pro-life legislation. So here, recognizing there's an opportunity in the gubernatorial elections that are coming up. Here's a chance, to look at the candidates and to recognize we may have an opportunity to change leadership and advocate and vote for someone that will promote the common good. Abortion is never good for the common good. It is not good for society, and no matter how people try to convince people that it is never, because it's evil and it cannot be promoted. And we're talking about the murder of an innocent human life, the direct killing of another human being. So this is a chance in Pennsylvania. We have again, a governor there who has vetoed pro-life laws. So an example in that one, Wisconsin. Right? Here is a chance for Republicans are looking, to win a pro-life majority. So why? Because what happens here is that there's an opportunity to advance pro-life, laws and legislation. And so why not? So we need to see that, and I guess what we're trying to do today, Colleen, is just really show how serious, voting is. Mm-hmm. That it does, as we all know, I hope, it makes a tremendous impact. Positive or a negative. And what makes it negative is when we do nothing to stay against the evil that is being advocated for, or we actually vote for an evil that's going to be advocated for. We can't do that. We need to recognize we have an opportunity to stifle, eradicate, limit, the advancement of an evil. We must be engaged in this. On the good side of it, we, like in many states, we have pro-life legislation. We have pro-life advocacy. We have laws that are now advocating for life, not only life in the womb, which is the preeminent issue, as the bishops say, and make us continue to be aware of, but also they have pro-life laws to protect against euthanasia, to protect against embryonic stem cell research. We have states that do not allow human cloning, and we should not. We also have states that are striving to uphold. Now, right now, we have Oberville versus Hodges, which is a whole nother issue, but that's going to be coming to the forefront, this issue of the legalization and the imposition of the Supreme Court against the states that say that you must, have legalize and recognize same-sex unions. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about one of the non-negotiables here. So right now, we're not going to find, like we have with Roe, we have a difficulty that we got to keep working toward. Here is a chance. Right now, we may not win a judicial battle, but we have an opportunity to advocate for laws within the state that can challenge the law, challenge the situation, just like we've done with Roe all these many years. And we reached a point where we had a court that was courageous and willing to receive a challenge and recognize the opportunity before them to revisit the situation that was imposed upon our nation, and we can be here again. But if we don't stand up and advocate for people to be in those positions to advance those kinds of conversations, then the evil continues, mm-hmm. and it persists, and the mindset stays, the framework stays, the behavior stays, and we don't change direction. So that's why this is so serious, and this is why the church herself reminds us as Catholics to take this opportunity in the serious nature that it is and not take it lightly. And as we began with, to recognize that there are intrinsic evils that can never be advocated, never supported, and that I as a Catholic can never vote for. And I know that this is, for our listeners by majority, will understand this. But we know that, sadly, there are people who are claiming to be Catholic but advocating for these intrinsic evils. And this is scandalous, and it's promoting evil. It's advocating for evil, and there is never ever a justification. And so, and even though I may be in a situation where I have two candidates that both do not represent the fullness of Catholic teaching with regard to the dignity of human life and the recognition of what we're talking about, that the church does help me and help to make a decision in good conscience of how to approach those kinds of conversations. But the first thing is that I can never actively and intentionally vote or advance an intrinsic evil.
The other one I wanted to bring up that we forgot to mention was Vermont's proposal.
Please.
Yeah, so Vermont has Proposal 5, but I think it's going on the ballots as Article 22. And that one's basically just not quite directly quoting, but generally saying reproductive rights shall not be infringed is kind of the general gist of it. And from my understanding that right now they're specifically talking about abortion and contraception, but down the road it could be any number of anything that could be twisted to fit reproductive rights would fall under that. Right. So, and there's no thing saying children versus adults. There's nothing in that that's offering any type of protection for minors that Correct. In that way. So,
and again, just as we're doing is recognizing that our participation is to advance the good, to advance what is true, to advance what is just. And because we are in solidarity, because we are in part of the human family, that this concerns us. And that this does concern me because it concerns my neighbor. And who is my neighbor? Jesus helps us understand this very clearly. Everyone is my neighbor. And so, but to recognize the vulnerable, the poor, those who are defenseless, who cannot defend themselves, the innocent. So here, the preborn child, our elderly, our handicapped, our disabled, those who are having difficulties in cognitive abilities, the vulnerable. We need to look at that and recognize that there is, in a sense, that every life is of value. And we must protect that life. And we need to make sure that we're not assaulting human life. And, which goes back to the whole embryonic stem cell research. We want moral research. We want to advocate for moral means to answer human questions and to deal with medical issues and healthcare issues. And we want human flourishing, absolutely. But then again, the ends do not justify the means. We cannot take the life or commodify a human life, and in order to obtain that end which is the good that we're wanting to obtain. But in order to get there, you have to commit this evil. No, can't do this. And so it's important for people to see that and understand. And of course, they love tugging on the strings, as we all know. It's all hard cases. It's always these difficult situations that you see the other side play. But the church again helps us to approach these conversations and how to articulate, a response to those kinds of cases. And what's beautiful is the church's teaching, the moral principles, the moral tradition was the same yesterday, today, and will be the same tomorrow. And so that no matter what, every life is of value, has intrinsic and comparable value, at every stage. And it doesn't change. Whether they're in early development, whether they are an older age, or there's a healthcare issue, that doesn't change. So it's important for us as we approach these to look at it that way, because that's what the other side is trying to say, that some have value, some don't. We could use people for this kind of situation because we're trying to make this good, or we can manipulate human persons, to create other human persons. Or we can, advocate for the natural institution that is God created, God given between a man and a woman in the sacred institution of holy matrimony, and to recognize the dignity of marriage upon which society is built and upon which children are welcomed and upon which our society flourishes. And this is something we must advocate for. And so we I guess by re-emphasizing, repeating, as I'm doing and we're doing together, is to show how important this is.
Yeah. Well, and also I think it's important as Americans to see what's going on in other states, because it might not be your state right now, but that's how they've always pushed things through, like starting like before Roe, it was like legalize it in this specific state, legalize it in that state. And then it led to Roe. And you saw the same thing with quote, marriage and the way that got legalized before the Supreme Court decision. So I think it's very important as Americans to look at what's going on in states that even aren't yours, so you're aware what trends are happening in California or New York or Vermont or Michigan, and just be able to take that step back and say, wow, if it passes there, what if it's my state next?
That's correct.
And if it doesn't pass there, maybe that will be the guard holding it back.
Exactly. And I think like just using California, because it's one that's, I've been
You know
working a
a lot
little more
about that.
closely
Yeah.
with, is to recognize that by rejecting Proposition 1, first of all, we're preventing a far greater assault on human life. It's already a very bad situation. The law in California is already very bad and already assaults human life. But if this were allowed to continue, it would only fortify that and strengthen it. Now, reverse that. If we can, which I hope will be the case, and I pray it will be the case, we reject Proposition 1, and what happens? Now you can come back to the current law and say, wait a minute, we can challenge this, and it will be challenged. And the other side knows this. This is why they're doing what they're doing, because they know that there's a mindset within right now within American people. There is a sense that they don't like this abortion, as it is, and so we have to recognize that there's an opportunity here. And I can tell you globally, Colleen, this is what I hear in the global, working with our affiliates and directors around the world. They saw the overturning of Roe as something that would never happen, because this was what everyone's been told. Oh, it'll never happen. It's now law, blah, blah, But in reality, by the overturning of Roe and Casey, it sends a message that laws can change, that very egregious laws can be reevaluated, and we can set a different course, and we can recognize we've done something harmful here. This has not promoted the common good. It has been detrimental to society, and we can show how detrimental abortion is to our society. And it's there. It gets hidden because the media doesn't support, truth. It supports its agenda, its ideology, and its right line in this. And we know that people, entities like Planned Parenthood, are backing many of these propositions and amendments. We know this because it's out there. Mm-hmm. And so, but here's a chance with that turn. They saw it. Wait a minute. If the U.S. can do this, then we can do this in our country. And that's what happened in Poland in 1993. And Poland has continued to advocate and push forward for protecting human life. And we saw this in Hungary in 2012. And we can see it in other countries where challenges are happening. So this is what can happen here. So I'm with you, Colleen, and agree with what you're saying, is that to see this, what's happening in the neighboring state, positive or negative, has an impact on the other states. And we know that the state of California and the state of New York have the largest percentage of abortions in this country. So they are, in a sense, ground zero. And if we can move the conversation toward life, inching our way, then we know the impact that will have. And it will reverberate in other states. Mm-hmm. So I really see this as a very important moment, in California and in other states that have initiatives that require people who are, one, Catholic, two, Christian, our Jewish brothers and sisters, and many other faith traditions that do not believe in the violence of abortion, do not want to see abortion furthered, or the ability of the state to impose an unending limit or no limit whatsoever. I think there's opportunity here. And I want to encourage people to really take these November elections, whatever is in your state, seriously, and to realize that we can make a powerful difference. And we can set a stage for the next 2 years in anticipation of another set of federal and state level elections, which can, again, reverberate. That's what we want.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Father, for doing this podcast. I'm really glad that we were able to have some kind of resource about voting before these elections. And to everyone listening on YouTube or Rumble, please like, subscribe, follow. And if you're listening on any of our audio platforms, please follow us, share it with your friends, and keep on living the culture of life. And did you want?
Just one last thing before.
Okay.
Just go back to those. If you, are you going to post those websites for our listeners? Sorry, I want to make sure that we get that out there so people can come back to
the guides for voting.
Right.
Yeah. That
would be very good. So it's the EWTN, and I know you're going to make those available. Mm-hmm. And the one that's a little shorter but a little more concise is Priests for Life.
Yes.
Voting guide. Both of them are very, very good. And again, for more information on this, on what I would finally add, Colleen, is that back to for people in each state, if you go to the bishop's website and you go to their website and look up the pro-life advocacy, that's where you're going to see what the bishops are talking about in the current election. If there's something that's out there, they're dealing with it. So please, let's help guide people toward that as well.
Yes, and the Right to Life offices.
All 50 states, and Puerto Rico.
Okay.
Need to have their eyes open right now to all what's available, what's coming up in the midterm election in November.
Very important. Get out and vote too. Thank you so much. Keep on living the culture of life. God bless.